Latter-day Peace Studies is produced by peace-loving members of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Any views expressed herein are not to be taken as official positions of the Church or its authorities.
Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm Christopher Hurtado.
And I'm Ben Peterson.
Thank you for joining us as we discuss this week's reading of Come Follow Me as outlined by The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Our hope is that as we discuss the Scriptures, we will come to a more perfect understanding through experiencing the atonement of Jesus Christ and find greater peace in our lives. Welcome back to Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I am your co-host Christopher Hurtado.
And I'm Ben Peterson.
It's good to be with you back on the mic again, Ben. It has been a few weeks since we've recorded. Not that anyone would know that listening. Here we are covering the second half of Hebrews. By the second half, I mean 7 through the end. Chapter 7 through the end. I just wanted to go over a little bit of what Hebrews is again since last time, since not everybody necessarily heard the introduction to Hebrews in the first half. And that is, things like this document. Didn't we say it's called the Epistle of Paul to the Hebrews in the King James Bible?
Right, and it's not any of those. It's not an epistle, it's not by Paul, and it's not necessarily to the Hebrews.
Right, we don't really know much about it. We don't even know exactly when this was written. One of the questions that might be helpful to answer to be able to really understand this book or epistle, if you want to call it that, it does have something at the end. We'll get to that at the end.
It's more
it
like
looks
a
like
sermon,
somebody tacked
right?
on. It does seem more like a sermon, but there's something, a letter closing that looks like it was tacked on to the end to make it look like a letter.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a sermon, and it is this sustained argument on the nature of Christ. We don't see anything like it. We haven't seen anything like it since John, right? The Gospel of John.
Yeah.
And I don't think we'll see anything like it again in the New Testament. So it's a sustained argument on the nature of Christ, this high Christology. I remember when I first said that, Ben, you said John was sustained. It's really not, right? John is in
Not
one
as
chapter.
sustained.
That's right. Not chapters and chapters, right? So there's that. It's hard to tell when this was written. It might be helpful, I started to say, if we could know if it was written before or after the destruction of the temple. Ben, you have some insights into why it's hard to tell one way or the other.
Yeah, it's difficult because the way the author talks about the rituals of the sacrifices can make you think, oh, they're talking about something that's going on right now. And so in that sense, you think, well, then that means it's before the temple because there's nothing in it that necessarily indicates that it is after. And then at the same time, you think, well, the author is talking about really not the temple. They're talking about the tabernacle, and it's all based on an understanding of their reading of the Septuagint, which is the Greek Jewish scripture, right? The Greek translation of the Jewish scripture. And that all centers around this wilderness tabernacle. And so there's no mention of the temple per se. It's all about the tabernacle, which means, this is a person that's really hasn't had firsthand experience with the temple. And so that could mean that they are speaking after the temple is destroyed and just about this theoretical or this sacred history or this historical type temple, ideal temple, which really fits in with the overall idea that they are presenting of the temple being a shadow. And what they're really trying to get at is the true reality of heaven, right? That Christ has entered, which we'll get into, sort of a Platonic idea. But
very much so, yeah.
You're kind of back and forth. I'm sure some of this will come up as we go through it, that it's kind of ambiguous as to, whether it's before or after that period that they're writing.
Yeah, it's really kind of hard to tell. And it's one of the things that makes it hard to tell what this is and what to do with it, right? Another thing about this letter or sermon is that unlike other epistles that claim to be by Paul's, this one doesn't. We said that in the King James Bible, the title says that, but it doesn't say anywhere in the book of Hebrews that it's by Paul. So it doesn't actually make that claim. So it's completely anonymous. Now, Pauline authorship was debated early on in Christian history. And then, and for centuries, it was rejected in terms of its canonicity, which is really surprising that it ends up back on the canon. It has some things that tip it off as not really being from Paul. Obviously, the language, the style, even the purpose is different from Paul. Paul doesn't, he doesn't go into this kind of high Christology. He's more concerned with justification in the present, salvation in the future. This looks like it's post-Paul. It seems like, again, like a sermon. It actually tells us in chapter 13, verse 22, that it's a word of exhortation, right? There is sort of, on the pre-70 AD dating side of things, there's nowhere mention of the destruction of the temple. Again, there's just the tabernacle, right? The wilderness tabernacle. But again, you never know, because there are texts that show up after, Jewish texts after the destruction of the temple, that still read as if the temple were still standing, right? It seems maybe, I don't know, like it's just hard to come to terms with it. It's gone, but it'll come back, maybe something like that. But certainly in this text, we get something really different, as you said, something very Platonic, where the earthly temple is just a shadow of the heavenly temple, and that's what matters anyway.
Well, and I think one of the things that we said last time was one of the arguments, I guess you could say, for it being pre-destruction of the temple is that the purpose of this author seems to be to persuade the people away from a temple ritual type of thing towards Jesus, right? Saying that doesn't matter anymore, or that is not important anymore because Jesus completed all of that. And so it's the supersession type of thing, right? That old is done away. It's out of date. It's expired, so to speak. And in that argument, you would think that if the temple is destroyed at the time that they're writing it, that would be a very strong point towards their argument that they could be making, saying, hey, the temple's gone, but it's okay. It doesn't matter because we have Jesus, right? And they don't really say it in that way. And since they don't, that does kind of make me think it's before, because that would be, in my opinion, a very strong argument to make towards the people that would otherwise be interested in perpetuating temple worship, right?
I would agree. Yeah, it seems like it would have bolstered the author's argument. So very much Platonic. We have at this period in history, Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish Platonist, writing a lot. It doesn't necessarily mean that our author knows Philo, but our author does know Platonism. So you don't have to read Philo to know Platonism. It's part of the zeitgeist, right? It's part of the spirit of the times, all this Platonism that happens. But it could be that because even without reading Philo, that the setting for this is Alexandrian, right? Philo's part of the Alexandrian school. And so that's possible, but we don't really know. One thing that's really different, again, from Paul's letters is it's not really addressing this sermon. It's not addressing local circumstances. Paul's letters do that. Again, really sophisticated Greek, rhythmic cadences, alliteration, poetic devices, all kinds of fancy stuff that Paul doesn't do. As well as Paul knows his, Greek rhetoric, he doesn't quite go this exalted, let's say.
No, this person is a little more accomplished Greek rhetor.
That's right. And again, this high Christology, you have Jesus being the Son of God, superior to all other beings, even angels. He's uncreated, he's immortal, he's permanent. He's superior even to all the biblical heroes, and that includes Moses and Abraham. And even institutions like the Levitical priesthood. We'll go into Melchizedek. I think we start off talking about Melchizedek, right? Going into this week's reading, and how there becomes this priesthood of Melchizedek that's higher than the Levite priesthood, and what that does for the Christology. We'll talk about that. And so Jesus is he's this heavenly priest, making a sacrifice in a heavenly temple that supersedes the earthly temple. And in fact, every idea that we get, I think, from Jesus superseding this kind of Christian theology, superseding and making the Old Testament or Jewish view outdated, really comes from this book. Yeah, so this is called, again, supersessionist theology, even rejection or replacement theology. And so in some sense, that makes it one of the most anti-Jewish books, not anti-Semitic, right, but anti-Jewish. It's anti-Judaism. Judaism is an inferior religion. At best, it's a precursor to Christ. That's, again, a very typical Christian view, right? But where does it come from? And the answer is right here in Hebrews.
Okay, so then we're coming into chapter 7 now. We talked about last time 1 through 6. And at the very end of 6, there's a mention of this Melchizedek. And 7 jumps right into a discussion of Melchizedek. And this is kind of strange to me. Even coming from a Latter-day Saint all my life background, where we have Latter-day Saint sources and scriptures that have additional commentary and speculation on this, there's still this question, like, who was Melchizedek? In terms of what we find from the Bible, at least Jewish Old Testament or the Jewish scripture, we have very little, right? So who does the author of Hebrews, this was kind of my question, right? Who does the author of Hebrews think Melchizedek was, and why does that matter to this argument here? And we need to hold off for a minute, I think, on bringing in, let's go to Alma chapter 13 in the Book of Mormon, or let's go to the Joseph Smith translation about Melchizedek, or, let's go to Doctrine and Covenants and say, that'll tell us what Melchizedek is. That's fine, but that doesn't tell us who the author of Hebrews thought Melchizedek was, right? And so that may not be relevant to the author's argument. So I just want to caution, maybe Latter-day Saint listeners against bringing in those sources as a way of interpreting Hebrews, at least from the beginning, right? I would say step back, figure out what the author is saying about this Melchizedek, and then for your own, later study, I think you could bring in those sources to try to fill out some other understanding you're having.
Ben, would you also leave out then sort of, the apocryphal works of Enoch, right? Books of Enoch?
I don't know. That's a good point, because this author, we don't know for sure, but it's very possible that this author is using those sources as their basis for their understanding of Melchizedek. So that is a good point, that we need to consider what might be in these apocryphal sources that were available to this author at the time.
Okay, so to give us that background, in addition to what little there is in Genesis, let's start there actually. What do we know about Melchizedek from Genesis?
Well, basically all we have from Genesis on Melchizedek is Abraham, after he goes and rescues his servants and destroys the people that kidnapped him, so to speak, right? He has all this plunder, and he brings it back with him, and he pays 1/10 of it to Melchizedek, the king of Salem. But we don't know who this person is and why Abraham is doing it. It just says that he goes and does it, and he blesses Abraham. That's basically all we have from Genesis. Okay. And then the only other reference we get to Melchizedek is something in the Psalms, which this author is going to bring up later, and is central to their entire argument. And it's these few verses in Psalm 110 that talk about, they say, "Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And this phrase is understood to be talking about the Messiah, has been understood to be talking about the Messiah by, Jewish interpreters, rabbinical or midrash tradition from, very anciently, way before the time of the author of Hebrews, right? And so within their interpretation is going to come the assumption, the strong assumption, that Psalm 110 is about the Messiah. And then within the Christian context, that means it is about Jesus, right?
Yeah. So, and it's funny to note that I think, when it comes to Abraham paying tithing to this king of Salem, which is not necessarily clear what that is. It could be Jerusalem. It's going to be understood later on as he was king of Jerusalem. Also, his name isn't really a name. Melchizedek means Melchizedek, right? It's my king, the righteous one, something like that. So who is this strange person, right? It gets even stranger if we go into the Apocrypha, where we actually get some of our ideas about Melchizedek from, and maybe our author too, right? And that's from the books of Enoch. I don't remember which one. There's not one book of Enoch. We talk about the book of Enoch, but there's really more than one book of Enoch. But in those writings, we get that Melchizedek was born from his mother's corpse, which is really strange. Born from a corpse, is born a high priest. So he's a high priest from birth. And he was related to Noah. He survives the flood so that he can be a high priest to Noah's family. It's really strange. And by the way, some of it has some things in common with the idea of the Messiah himself, right? Mm-hmm. The sort of the eternality, the, born whatever he is from the beginning, those kind of things. Not born prototype. From a virgin, but from a corpse, right? Yeah. Some kind of archetype or prototype for the Messiah. Very strange stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we get these statements in here in Hebrews, the author saying he's without father or mother, right?
That's right.
And so it's like, well, I mean, does that mean genetically he just popped into existence? Or is it like, the Apocrypha says, well, his father maybe had already died and he was born from his mother's corpse. And so as soon as he's born, he already, doesn't have a mother. So, obviously you could take it either way, but just reading from the text of Hebrews, you don't know what he means by that, right?
Yeah, and what's implied when Abraham pays what we call tithing, which is kind of funny, right? Because we're talking about booty. He's paying a tenth of his booty. I don't think that's what we think of normally when we think of tithing. And it's interesting to note that this isn't a verse that comes up in discussions about tithing, right? We always go to Malachi. But here, Abraham paying a tenth of the booty to Melchizedek means somehow that Melchizedek is superior to Abraham.
Yeah, that's the implication here, that not only is Melchizedek superior to Abraham, because of the tithing, but also because he blesses him, right? It says that, the inferior is blessed by the superior. He says it is beyond dispute, right? It's just like this axiom that he takes. And therefore, we know for sure that Melchizedek was superior to Abraham. And so that, again, that's central to his argument, because the idea is that Melchizedek was of some higher order that is outside the conventional order. The Israelites and the Jews are going to take their legitimacy from Abraham and his order, so to speak, and then through the Levitical priesthood, their right to those rituals and ordinances within the tabernacle, within the temple worship. And the author of Hebrews is coming in and saying, well, wait, there was someone that was outside of that tradition, so to speak, and someone who was greater than Abraham, this Melchizedek. And so therefore, there's something that precedes this Levitical concept, something that is superior to it, and that the Levitical priesthood, or the Aaronic, as the priestly order of Aaron, is something that is like a step down or something inferior in some way to the ideal of the Melchizedek.
Isn't it important for this author, Ben, because Jesus doesn't come from the Levitical line, he comes from a Davidic line. And so this Melchizedek is going to be in that line, and that's how Jesus can then be a high priest.
Yeah, and it's a little bit of a conflated argument here, because the author is saying, okay, this Melchizedek was outside of the conventional order, outside the line. And since Psalm says that, the Messiah would be a priest after the order of the Melchizedek, then the author makes the conclusion that means the Messiah could not be through the order of the Levitical, which we get from other sources that, the Messiah would be of a certain line, right? A Davidic line, which would be Judah, right? Not Levitical. But in any case, the argument he's making here is that he wouldn't be in that Levitical line. Now, there seems to be, as I've read through Hebrews, sort of the undertext here, what I'm reading between the lines is that this seems to be an argument that is being made to an audience that is more of the priestly class, right? Like the Levitical line. Now, remember back when we were in the Old Testament, we were talking about the documentary hypothesis, where there were these multiple different sources. And we may have identified 4 or 5 different sources, and it turns out, it's even more complex than that. But in any case, one of the main sources that scholars identify in the Old Testament is the priestly source.
And Ben, that gives us the differences between, for example, Genesis 1 and 2, where you have these
Correct.
2 different creation stories, which are 2 out of 3, because there's another creation story in the Bible that's sort of spread out a little bit. I want to compare it to the Quran in that sense. And so one of those is priestly and demonstrates priestly concerns, and so is very different from the other.
That's right. Yeah. And so especially like our maybe most intact example of a priestly source is the book of Leviticus, right? And so that, is maybe a particular strain of priestly. It's like the holiness tradition. But in any case, the book of Leviticus is a priestly manual. And it's very, concerned with the duties within the tabernacle and the sacrifices and why and all that sort of stuff.
So we don't really have Paul's concern with what role the Torah plays in, I'll say, Christianity. But we do have, if you're right about this source being priestly, we do have those concerns being addressed. What about the priesthood? What about the whole temporal rights? What about all that? Yeah. And this is going to be important for this author who's going to have Jesus be this high priest and sacrifice. He's going to enter the heavenly temple and be the priest who offers himself as the sacrifice.
Yeah. And, if this sermon, this book of Hebrews, is a response to something, right? A response to either an attitude or a question or a rejection raised about Jesus, then what the author could be responding to is a priestly or Levitical assertion that they have the authority, right? The right of the priestly line to do these ordinances of the temple. God said so, right? And so the argument here that is being made by the author of Hebrews seems to be aimed at that, seems to be saying, yes, that was established. However, God is providing something that supersedes that, right? And we see the example of this in Melchizedek, and we even know the Messiah is supposed to be after the order of Melchizedek. And if it's after the order of Melchizedek, we know that Melchizedek was outside of that order of Abraham. And so it's something greater and superior even to that line, right? That you ascribe to, even the line of Abraham. It's something even far superior to that. And it's this Melchizedek. And so, the priestly argument might have been, yes, he's from David, but he should also be, right, from the priestly line. And that could have been more of their sort of claim to the Messiah, that Levitical line. And so again, this is like a response to that, to saying, no, the Messiah doesn't have to be from the Levitical line because he is after the order of Melchizedek. And Psalm 110 says he's after the order of Melchizedek, which is outside that, right? And I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, but again, this is central to the author's argument about who Jesus is. And it does seem to be, in a way, a response to a rejection of maybe Jesus's ancestry or his authority, things like that.
Well, Ben, where does that leave us then? Going back into the text, chapter 7, I know we're going to talk about some Platonism a little bit. At some point, I'll leave it up to you whether you want to bring in the LDS sources that aren't necessarily, part of the context of our author. They're likely not, right? We do have later sources. You could still bring those in at will.
Yeah, I mean, I'll mention them here. Like I said before, one of the more noteworthy ones might be Alma chapter 13, where Alma goes into Melchizedek, and he doesn't say a ton beyond actually what Genesis and Psalms says. He just interprets it in a way, because Alma's context in his discussion in Alma chapter 13 is something totally different to his talking to the people of Ammonihah, because he's discussing authority and where his authority comes as a priest in opposition to, or as separate from, like a state type of authority that it is there to impose by force. Alma is saying, no, this authority of the priesthood is something different. It's not a violent type of authority, right? This is authority based on faith. And so then he goes into a concept of that. And again, I don't know that that's really relevant to what you may be able to make some ties and conceptual ties there, but I don't think that what Alma says about Melchizedek is related specifically to the argument that the author of Hebrews is making here. So
anything else from LDS canon?
That comes to me just off the top of my head.
So what do we do with this Melchizedek, and meaning what is the author of Hebrews doing with this Melchizedek figure?
Well, again, he is setting this Melchizedek up as a prototype of Christ, or of Jesus, the Messiah, but then, by extension, the author is saying that's Jesus. And so he then presents Jesus as that, superseding the Levitical priesthood and the way that they do things, to say that was just a shadow, right? That was done over and over again as pointing you to the true, right? The substance of the thing. So
is this a good time then to go into chapter 8, verse 5, where we read of sketches and shadows in the NRSV translation? What does the King James read in 8:5?
Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5 in the King James says, "Who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle."
Which in the NRSV is a tent, right? We understand the tabernacle to be a tent.
Yeah.
Have you ever been to the model that they made at BYU? Or I guess they've done this more than once. I think I've been a couple of times with my family. Have you done that?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, they make a life-size model of this, and it is a tent, right? With tent-like walls outside it, around it, right? Making that courtyard. So let's talk a little bit about Platonism to make some sense out of what's going on here. In the Platonic idea, and that's not meant to be a pun, there is this theory of ideas in Plato, also known as Plato's theory of forms. So we can call it ideas or forms. It's what's called here not the shadow. The shadow would actually be not the form, not the idea. So there's a heavenly or otherworldly, more real version of everything that we see here on earth. And so there's the famous painting in the Sistine Chapel that shows Plato and Aristotle side by side. And Plato is pointing up and Aristotle is pointing down. And this is the biggest difference between these two philosophers, Aristotle being the student of Plato. Plato's teaching that everything that is most real is above. And what you see down here below is just a shadow.
Yeah.
Whereas for Aristotle, what is most real is here. And what this points at, with these philosophers pointing up and down, what this points at is a problem in philosophy called the problem of universals. The question is, what is the ontological status? And ontology is a branch of metaphysics which deals with the nature of being itself,
existence,
right? Existence itself. What is the beingness? What is the existence of, what is the nature of the existence of universals, right? So we have a table here, a table there. You have coffee table, side table, dining table, this table, that table, the other table. But then there's this idea of table, right? And when I say idea, this idea of table, that's what's called in Platonism the form of the table, or the idea of the table. And so for Plato, the explanation of how there can be tables on earth is that they participate in the form of the table. That's what makes them table.
The ideal, the essence of tableness.
Exactly. The idea or form of the table is tableness itself, and it has more ontology, more being, more reality than the actual tables we see. For Aristotle, it's the other way around, right? The tables are the most real. And then we somehow conceptualize, right, the idea of a table out of those. But for Plato, he's explaining this universal of tableness or tablehood as primary and prior to, having primacy over the actual tables. And so in this same way, the author of Hebrews is telling us there is a temple in heaven, as it were, which is more real than the temples on earth, or the tabernacle, as it were, that being just a shadow of the heavenly temple. And so the work that the priests do in the tabernacle, the Levitical priesthood in the tabernacle, is going to be lesser than the work that this priest of Melchizedek, right? This priest who is Jesus is going to do in the heavenly temple.
It's sort of like a pretend, right? The pretend work that is imitating the true essence, right?
That's right. It's only something that's done, let's say, as a ritual, whereas what Jesus is doing is real.
Mm-hmm. You know, this debate survives till today.
It does.
Even within philosophy and even within science. A couple examples of this that I see is one that's going on right now with AI, with artificial intelligence, called machine learning, where the way that the machine extracts some ideal or essence of a thing is it's presented, many thousands or millions of examples of something, and then it is able to extract whatever that essence is from that, right? That's very Aristotelian, and it works, right? Like we're able to do something with that, like practical, right? But then within science, there is becoming there's this concept of the theories of everything, where people are trying to sort of hash out what is the basis of existence, right? And the more and more that they've looked into it, the theories that seem to be explaining it the best are centering on, well, the reality that we perceive is merely a projection of our own consciousness. And there's something that is more real going on, that our consciousness either is the reality or has access to, but in a subconscious way, and then we project reality out from us in the other way, right? I know this is kind of a strange and esoteric idea. I only mention it to say that, look, these ideas that this author is dealing with in Hebrews 2,000 years ago we're still struggling with today, right?
That's right. This problem of the universals, as we call it in philosophy, hasn't gone away. And as a matter of fact, since you brought consciousness into it, that's one of the questions, right? The question is, which comes first, consciousness or existence?
Right.
And the idea of creatio ex nihilo, right? Creation out of nothing, is that there's a consciousness, which then produces everything of which to be conscious.
Yeah.
And the idea of creatio ex materia is that no, there's always something, and that's how there can be consciousness of it. And these questions are unresolved. The philosophers continue to argue about these things to this day.
Well, Mormonism tries to synthesize that in some ways by saying that all material has consciousness, right? And so a different level of consciousness. And so they mash those concepts into one in some ways. So verses 6 through 13 of chapter 8, these are dealing with the idea that you brought up, Christopher, of the new covenant. Okay, so in the Old Testament, there's these verses, particularly in Jeremiah, that talk about God is going to establish a new covenant with the Jewish people, with the Israelites. And they are sort of couched in the context of them having gone into exile and them longing for the return. And if they can return, then God is going to reestablish the covenant, a new covenant, and it's going to be better this time in some way, right? How exactly, we don't know, but he says he's going to write the law in their hearts. And so this just opens up all kinds of ideas that have sprung from this idea of this new covenant. And this is sort of a watershed passages for Christians, particularly refining this, coming from the arguments made in Hebrews, because the argument being made is, look, God said he was going to do this. He's going to do a new covenant, and it's supposed to be better, right? That's the implication of their interpretation of Jeremiah. It's going to be better. And so therefore, the idea of this new covenant, and then the idea of the Messiah, and then the idea of rebuilding the temple all become put together in the concept of Jesus within Christianity. Okay. And so Jesus brings the new covenant, and he's the new high priest, says the author of Hebrews. And the temple isn't the building. The temple is the people. And he's going to gather all the people, Jew and Gentile, right? And he's going to make a temple out of the people. And that's where his spirit's going to dwell. And he's going to put his law in their hearts, as Paul says, right? Because Paul is talking about things being written in the fleshy tables of our hearts. And that's the law, right? It's going to supersede that law that is dead. And so all of these ideas are sort of coalescing in the argument that the the author of Hebrews is making here, saying that the law of the gospel is superseding the law of Moses. Now, that is, again, sort of what the Christian concept is that coming out of this. But we should mention that the Jewish idea from Jeremiah, there's not one idea, but one of the principal Jewish ideas was that, yes, they're going to return as a people and rebuild the temple, and that happens, right? Okay, so they do return, and Cyrus gives them the funds, and then over a couple generations, they do rebuild this temple, and it's the Second Temple period. But it's just not the same, right? They don't have all the same things. They're constantly being taken over and ruled by other people, the Greeks, and then they do have a period of independence, and then they have the Romans come in, right? And so there's this constant sort of turmoil with, are we really a free people? Have we really achieved the same level of greatness that we had in the days of David? And so that's why we talked about all this when we did the intro to the New Testament, because this is all the milieu of going into the world of Jesus, and that he wasn't the only Messiah figure, right? This is a time when the people are really sort of grasping at fulfillment of all of these things that they saw as prophecies. And so there are many messiahs that come up that promise different things, and different stuff happens. And so it's not just Jesus, right? In fact, there's more than one named Jesus even, right?
That's right. Yeah. So what I hear you saying, Ben, is this isn't just a new covenant. It's a new and improved covenant.
Yeah.
Right? There is that. No, by the way, the other thing to say about what you've said, Ben, is things are never as good as they used to be.
Right. The good old days.
And that's part of the human experience, right? The good old days that, things just never as good as they used to be. And that's because we romanticize the past. And the authors of these texts were no more immune to that than we are today. The past is never what it used to be. Did I say that right? The past is never what it used to be. Does that make sense? So we have some verses here that are quoted, right? In verses 8 through 12, they're quoted from the Septuagint, from Jeremiah. And there are some discrepancies, actually, between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. The Septuagint being the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which is what was being worked with in this milieu, right? And then there's the Masoretic text that's the oldest extant Hebrew text of the Hebrew Bible, but that's actually newer than the Septuagint. It's a back translation from Greek, and it's newer. So the oldest extant Old Testament or Hebrew Bible we have is Greek.
Yeah, that's correct. We do have some texts from Dead Sea Scrolls. For instance, they're not as old necessarily as some of the Septuagint material. And also remember, sometimes we have this idea that like the Septuagint was this single thing all translated within one fell swoop, right? But it probably happened over periods of time and then was collected into a single work. And so, the reality is always more complicated than the explanation, right?
Yeah.
So the Masoretic text, though, is from like 9th or 10th centuries AD, right? This is like 1,500 years, or maybe not quite 1,500 years, maybe like 12 or 1,300 years after the text of the Septuagint. So
I think, this is hard for people to wrap their brains around, that the oldest Hebrew text we have is newer by, you said, 1,500 years than the Greek, right? So, and it's a back translation,
years, but yeah,
over 1,000 years. So there's a significant difference between some of these verses. So in the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, right? And that's probably 31-32, because the Septuagint says, I had no concern for them, whereas the Masoretic text has it, I was their husband. So it's one of those instances again, right? Yeah. I get it. This happens all the time, right? There's so many footnotes that we haven't even mentioned on this podcast where we see, oh, by the way, there are ancient manuscripts that read the exact opposite of this.
Right.
So don't get hung up on verses, right? At proof texting, especially.
Right.
There's work to do in understanding these texts. And Ben, I think you've given us a really good tip and you're a good example in terms of, let's try to understand this text in the context in which it is written. And so in the context in which it is written, we have the Septuagint, and it tells us I had no concern for them. So never mind that the Masoretic text later on is going to say I was their husband.
Yeah, those are different things. Now in chapter 9, the author starts talking about the tent that was constructed. So verse 2, it says a tent was constructed, right? So, we mentioned that this is talking primarily about the tabernacle, not the temple. So this could mean, as we were saying, that the author is mostly concerned with what the Torah says and not the reality of the temple itself. And so this makes it difficult to say for sure if this is written before or after the destruction of the temple, like we said. Then in verses 6 through 9, so the idea here is that since the high priest of the tabernacle is the only one to enter the Holy of Holies, and it is done under the cover of the outer tent, then this indicates that the way to enter the Holy of Holies had not been revealed yet, but was being kept symbolically secret. So again, these verses talk about how they went into the outer tent, and then there was just the high priest that went into the inner tent, but that was hidden from the people as a whole. And so the author is making the argument here that there was going to be at some point revealed the true way to the Holy of Holies. And so this was done to symbolically present that we don't know the way for everyone to get into the Holy of Holies yet. And so we just send the high priest in there. And so Jesus has entered the true Holy of Holies, and he did so in view of all to see, right? He was crucified, and he died and was resurrected, and he has entered into the true Holy of Holies, heaven, and we have all the witnesses of that, right? And so that's the argument that the author is making here. It might seem a little tenuous, a little strained, but it's important for them to couch all that Jesus did in the context of what's going on with this tabernacle and how it's used. Again, this all tells me that he's speaking, or his audience is probably a priestly audience that is very much concerned with these tabernacle or tent rituals, right? And so presenting Jesus in that context, I think the author is hoping that will help them be more receptive to Jesus and the Christian message.
That's an interesting argument. Here's another one from verses 13 through 14, right? For if the blood of goats and bulls with the sprinkling of the ashes of a heifer sanctifies those who have been defiled so that their flesh is purified. So that's the premise upon which the argument that follows is based. And to me, that's already a question, right? Well, does, the blood of goats and bulls and sprinkling of ashes of a heifer sanctify anyone? I don't know what Paul would say to that.
Yeah.
But the argument is very, very much in the style of Paul, right? At least those kind of arguments that were made, especially in Acts, right? Paul does usually make some kind of argument. The more specious ones, I think, are in Acts. And I remember you and I sort of making fun of some of those arguments where I don't know that Paul actually made those arguments. Now that we've studied Paul's letters, they're really different from Acts. So what follows then for this author is, if that works, how much more, verse 14, will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to worship the living God? And so I can't help but mention here the idea from Rene Girard, which was covered. It's something we've talked about here before. It was covered by Riley and me on the Latter-day Contemplation podcast, the latest episode that we've released. And we have a coming episode where we've interviewed an LDS scholar of Girard, someone who knew him personally. This theory of mimetic violence, the theory of scapegoating, of why it is that scapegoating happens, how it works. And what we see here in this book, in this sermon, again, it's not really an epistle, is the idea of Jesus becoming the scapegoat that ends all scapegoating.
Yeah. The great and last sacrifice.
That's right. Yeah. So for more on Girard, I would refer listeners to Latter-day Contemplation. So we have again in verse 24, Ben, an indication of the idea of the temple as opposed to the earthly one.
Mm-hmm.
For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands, a mere copy of the true one. Right, so that's, again, but he entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf, not in a symbolic presence of God in the Holy of Holies on earth, but in the actual presence of God. And this happens when? In verse 26, at the end of the age. Now, Ben, in pre-show discussion, I brought up this end of the age. This seems sort of tautological, right? It's because this is happening that it's the end of the age.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the end of the age because you're saying it's the end of the age. Yeah.
That's right. We're signaling here the beginning of a new age with this event. We're saying, and this is the idea, right, that we have in Christianity, that this is the meridian of time, right? We pass from what's old to what's new. And this, again, is happening right here in Hebrews.
And this sort of starts bleeding into the author's eschatology, right? Their end times concepts, right? How things are going to happen at the end. So in verse 28, we get, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. Now, I should note here that I said this has to do with eschatology, and I just realized, that's me imposing upon this an eschatological view, because we associate the second coming of Jesus with eschatology within the Christian concept, but they aren't necessarily the same thing, right? Jesus could come again and it's not the end of all things. It's just, that's the way that we commonly conceptualize of it. And this author actually in this verse isn't really necessarily saying anything about the end of all things. He does in the verse you read, Christopher, talk about the end of the age, but he's talking about that as if that age has just ended, right? Because Jesus just died and ascended and resurrected and ascended into heaven. And so the idea is that the people are waiting for Jesus to emerge from the Holy of Holies. So his ascension into heaven, he's gone into the Holy of Holies, just like the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies. And the high priest is supposed to do the atonement in there, right? He's supposed to sprinkle the blood. That's the Day of Atonement. And then he's supposed to emerge out and proclaim that the sins are atoned, right? Sin is atoned for the people. And so the idea is that, okay, Jesus has gone in there and we're waiting for him to come back out. And his emergence from the Holy of Holies will be not to purge sin necessarily, because that's what he's done in there, but it's going to be to save those who are waiting for him, right? His followers and his believers.
Right. And so I'm reminded of Yogananda's book, it's 2-volume book, The Second Coming of Christ, subtitled The Resurrection of the Christ Within You.
Yeah.
Right. So again, it doesn't have to be the end time. So this book teaches people how to fulfill what Yogananda considers the true promise of Jesus, not to return again in physical form, but within the souls of those who love him and commune with him. So very much in line with the idea of Hebrews, right? That there's not this, that there's on one hand something that happens physically, and that's actually a shadow, and then that there's something greater, right? Something more real that happens in the case of Jesus entering the Holy of Holies, actual presence of God, the actual Holy of Holies, which is in heaven, right? And in the case of ourselves, right, our own souls, that second coming of Christ that can happen within us.
I would love to hear a Sufi discussion I don't know if this is what you guys will choose, but I'd love to hear a Sufi discussion of this, because this concept has been very powerful for me to reconceptualize of the identity of Jesus within myself, and what that says for all kinds of things that we read in the scriptures, not least of which the second coming, right? That second coming of Jesus being within me, right? That is a very powerful concept, and for me has been even more powerful personally than some ethereal, future ambiguous concept of a return of Jesus that we don't know when, right? Or how, or whatever, right?
Or whether, right? Because we could be misreading it even, right? Mm-hmm. Again, what is the author of Hebrews telling us? Oh, you were misreading all of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Right? Sure. So who's to say we're not misreading the New Testament?
Yeah.
Right? And that we should be looking for this to happen to us personally, which, by the way, it can happen personally and it can happen
it could be
generally.
Both, right? Yeah. This isn't an exclusionary
and yet
thing.
What matters to me is what happens to me, right? To my own soul. And that's something that I have to work on. And so, yes, I very much agree. It would be a good discussion for Latter-day Contemplation Presents Come Follow Me between me and my co-host David Peck, Sufi Al-Hajj Dawood. And yet it may not be up to me to choose.
Yeah.
We take turns choosing the verses.
There may be some other better verses. I just, when we talked about that made me think, oh, there could be some Sufi discussion here, right?
Yeah, it's been really enlightening having those discussions, those Sufi discussions about the New Testament with David, for me and for others like yourself who've told me, as they've listened.
So again, in chapter 10, we just get this point reiterated, right? Verse 1, it's only a shadow, not the true form. It can never make perfect. And that idea of perfect is that true form, that essence, right? Those who approach, okay? Because it's just the shadow. The idea of all of the performances of the law of Moses and these sacrifices and stuff, they can't turn something into its true form because they aren't from the true form. They're just pretend, so to speak, right? Then in verse 4, we get, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins.
Oh, so there it is. Well, that's what, if it would be possible, we read in the earlier chapter, right? Then how much more possible is Christ doing what he does, right?
Yeah, this verse does seem to maybe a little bit undermine that earlier argument of the author, because the author is saying, hey, these sacrifices took away sin, therefore Jesus' sacrifice, does it even more. And it's like, well, if they don't ever, then how does, right? So I'm not sure exactly how the author would respond to me pointing out some apparent inconsistency here, that this verse might be undermining their earlier argument. But in any case, there is precedent within the Old Testament of the statement of the author here of Hebrews, because we get in Isaiah, as if we go to Isaiah chapter 1, verses 11 through 17, and in the interest of time, I don't read that through, but I encourage the listener to go and read Isaiah chapter 1, verses 11 through 17. And in those verses, the Lord is saying, hey, all of your sacrifices, he says, are an abomination to me. And why would he say that, right? Well, in the context of the verses, you get that what he's saying is you are, as Jesus says, forgetting the weightier matters of the law, right? There are all of these things that you're supposed to be doing, loving God and loving your neighbor, so to speak. And you aren't doing those things. You're doing just all the sacrifices and assuming that just by doing all these sacrifices and stuff, that your sins are going to be forgiven. And the Lord says, that's not it, right? That's not going to do it. Your sins aren't going to be atoned by doing those things, because you are forgetting the whole purpose of them. And the whole purpose of them is the love God, love your neighbor type of thing. And so the precedent of this idea isn't necessarily new with Jesus or with the author of Hebrews here, right? It's present within the book of Isaiah. And so the people within their understanding is this idea that there is a greater reality behind what they're doing, right?
So next, Ben, in chapter 11, we get a list of biblical heroes. And it's an interesting list because it sort of serves as a genealogy for early Christians, right? Because it gives us this lineage that's actually independent from the people of Israel. The heroes are all outsiders, right? And include non-Israelites. So Hebrews 11 is in some sense setting the stage for how eventually, and when I say eventually, I mean now, how we as Christians understand what we call the Old Testament as being a precursor to the New Testament. And I noticed there's something I wanted to bring up. I don't usually read the chapter headings in the LDS standard works. I did happen to notice this one, and there was something I thought was curious, and I brought it up to you in pre-show discussion, and you did have a response. Let's talk about that.
Okay.
We're told that all these biblical heroes who had faith in the LDS standard works in the chapter heading had faith in Christ. But I don't see any evidence of that other than one instance where it's Moses, right? And even that seems to be something that the author is probably self-conscious, aware that they're projecting back into the past, something that wasn't necessarily part of Moses's actual experience.
Yeah, I think what's going on with the author here, and then what we do as Latter-day Saints, is we have that first article of faith, right? And we say that, or I guess you could go to the fourth article of faith, the first principles and ordinances of the gospel are first faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. And so for Latter-day Saints, the concept of faith is very much tied to Jesus, to the person of Jesus. And the author here is pointing out the faith of all of these Old Testament heroes. And so I think as Latter-day Saints, we are inclined immediately to say, okay, then it has something to do with Jesus, right? And so, in a certain conceptualization, you can say that's true, because you could say, okay, well, if we're talking about faith, pistis, right? Actually, we're talking about trust. We're talking about faithfulness, a dedication to God. And within the Christian sort of conceptualization of that is done through Jesus. And so you're basically reading back into or applying a Christian standard to these Old Testament prophets, which you can do if you are wanting to just get Christian exegesis out of this, right? A Christological approach. But you have to step back for a second and be like, the faithfulness for the people who are Jewish scripture, right? Judaism, looking at this, isn't particularly about the Messiah. It's a broader concept, right? It's faithfulness to God. So
right, and not just Old Testament prophets, right? Because again, this is a list of outsiders, right? Mm-hmm. That includes non-Israelites, but other biblical heroes, as it were, what are going to be from Hebrews 11, the Christian biblical heroes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. We're adopting these into the Christian tradition. And so the way that you do that is to say that, well, it wasn't just faith, it was faith in Jesus, because they're part of that Christian tradition. And so they go all the way back to Abel, right? Cain and Abel. Obviously in the text, it's not saying this, but I think there is some implication of it, because when they get to Moses, it says it's in Christ. And so the Latter-day Saint interpretation is going to take it one step further and say, well, it was Abel's faith in Christ, right? And so again, that's just an adoption into the later conceptualization of a high Christology of Jesus as God. And so that works within a particular interpretation, but it's not the only way to view it, and it's not what the text says, right?
Right. So verse 26 does give us he, meaning Moses, considered abuse suffered for the Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. But again, that's the only instance of any of these biblical heroes having faith in Christ. And even this, again, seems sort of backward projecting in some sense.
Yeah, and a lot of the discussion here that he sort of the conclusions that he draws from a lot of these stories have to do with these people, these heroes, looking forward to something better, right? To a promised land, or he even says a city, right? And so that's why it says that Moses left Egypt, right? To go and get something better, right? Something that is going to be promised by God to them. And this is the story of the Bible, right? This is the story of the Book of Mormon. I mean, this is the story of the Doctrine and Covenants, so to speak. It's even the story that we get in the Pearl of Great Price with Abraham leaving his family. And in the prototypical sense, it's Adam and Eve leaving the garden, right? And so this going out to something and then looking forward to something better, a return to Eden, right? A city, a heavenly city, a Zion that we're going to return back to, right? This is this looking forward. And the author talks about how none of these people actually realized that. They never got to it, right? Moses never actually was able to get into the promised land. Abraham never actually realized the full promise of the Lord of his posterity, right? It was just this promise he was looking forward to. So he goes person after person and says, they never really got fully what they were promised. So does that mean God, wasn't faithful to them? And the argument is being, no, Jesus came and fulfilled all of that. And the fulfillment of that promise is going to be this heavenly city. This kind of moves into the promised land of the afterlife, right? And we're going to inherit that with them, right? They're going to be there with us.
So the story is still the same, right? And,
yes.
And to put it in Miltonian terms, after his paradise lost, we have paradise regained.
Yes. Yeah. Verse 16, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Right?
I think this is still something, Ben, that we can experience in the kingdom of heaven that is within us. Right? So again, I don't say that we cannot experience it when we die. I don't know. I do think we can experience it before we die. And I think, why wait? Why wait? Why not have that experience now? You know, Joseph Smith taught that happiness was the purpose of our existence, not just some future happiness, but current happiness. The circumstances of that teaching being unfortunate, that was his teaching.
And I do think that is, at least in part, what the author is saying here. Verse 1 of chapter 11 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." And that assurance, that word assurance, is coming from a Greek that means like an underlying essence to something, but it also means the title deed to a land, right? So wrapped up within this concept is both this heavenly essence of something and the deed, right? The actual realization of true ownership of a promised land. And so then in verse 13, we get, "They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth." And so this references to Abraham and his descendants being strangers in a foreign land, right? They went into Egypt and having faith for a promised land. And so the true promised land, again, is the afterlife. And we are strangers and foreigners here, you know, on the earth in this life. But our faith, that assurance, is tied to the underlying essence, right? And so we can experience that through our faithfulness right now, even though we haven't experienced it in the essential sense in the way that we will in that afterlife, right?
And this isn't a concept that's, you know, unique to Christianity. It appears also in Stoicism, right? In the writings of Epictetus, right? In the Enchiridion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a story that's picked up on by Al-Kindi later on in the Islamic tradition, the philosopher of the Arabs, as he was called. He expands on that story. It's part of the Muslim understanding in general, not just, you know, stories told by Al-Kindi from stories told by Epictetus, but part of the bigger picture, right? In terms of the sacred history and the eschatology and the whole, what we would call in Latter-day Saint terms, the plan of salvation. It wouldn't be called that way in the Muslim tradition, right? But still, there's this bigger picture, right, that we're talking about.
Yeah. Now, in chapter 12, there's just a few things I want to touch on here, Christopher. In verse 2, it says that Jesus is the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. However, the Greek lacks the pronoun our, right? It says Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. In other words, Jesus is the example of faithfulness, right? Of trust. He's that perfect example of that faithfulness and trust. Having gone all the way, he demonstrated what it means to be perfectly faithful. And so this isn't a statement about how Jesus acts upon our faith, right? He's not the perfecter of our faith. He's the example of what it means to be faithful.
That's where I'm reminded of, this is one of the many instances in which I'm reminded of the words of Alan Watts. Alan Watts is the one who brought, just like Yogananda I mentioned earlier, brought yoga to the West. Alan Watts brought Zen Buddhism to the West. We have Hazrat Inayat Khan at the head of my Sufi order who brought Sufism to the West. All this was happening around the same time too. This was at the dawning of the age we call Aquarius, right? Around the time I was born back in 1969. But Alan Watts said the religion of Jesus became a religion about Jesus and lost its power. And that's a paraphrase, but something like that, right? The religion of Jesus became a religion about Jesus and lost its power. The real power is in being like Jesus, not in worshiping Jesus.
Come follow me.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's something to think about. So one other thing in chapter 12 is this verse 14. I just thought it was beautiful. I don't know that I have any commentary on it. He says, "Pursue peace with everyone and the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and through it many become defiled."
That's beautiful. I have some similar verses I wanted to bring up at the beginning of the next chapter, of chapter 13. we begin, let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. So I have sort of mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I see some beautiful sentiments here and some great moral teachings. And I'll continue to read through some of this, but what I really wanted to do is to point out, maybe I won't continue to read through some of it, but at the beginning of chapter 13, right, from the first few verses, 1 through 5, and then verse 9, verse 16, verse 17, we get all kinds of do's and don'ts, mostly do's, right? But it just stands out to me that Paul has told us, right, it's not about doing all the things, right?
It's about whatever you do, do it with love. Yeah.
That's right. Exactly. That's I think a good interpretation of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, right? It's really about love. And that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, Ben, where if you think it's about just doing the things, right? Especially when it comes to rituals, right? That's not it. And so that was the message of Paul. This author is bringing us a new list of things to do. And I note that not only this sermon, but all of the pseudo-Pauline epistles, right, the ones that are disputed, one thing they have in common is that they seem to be introducing not faithfulness as Paul teaches, but rather correct belief. Not let's forget about doing all the things, but more things to do. Not Jesus, the mystery is that Jesus is with us. All of this, I'm contrasting between Paul and the pseudo-Pauline epistles, but rather Jesus, the mystery is Jesus is the head and the church is the body, and men are above women and slaves are under masters and things like this, right? These aren't really the teachings of Paul. But what we do get in these pseudo-Pauline epistles and here in Hebrews is more rules, more structure, more, I want to say, boundary maintenance and structuring
fences
of power
around, yeah.
Right, yeah, fences around the law, rather than Paul's message that the law is not really what it's about, that it never was.
It does seem rather ironic considering the 12 chapters that this author just spent on telling us that it's the essence that's the important thing, not all these shadows, right? And then here in chapter 13, he's like, here's a bunch of shadows, right? I get it, right? Like, in a certain sense, we can't talk about what we can't talk about. And so the only way we can talk about it is by saying, look, love might look like showing hospitality to strangers. It might look like, doing this. It might look like doing this.
Or doing that.
Often we equate the two, right? There's that false equivocation that, if you're doing this, that means you're doing it out of love. And right, that's not necessarily the case. You can do anything you want for any reason, and it doesn't mean it's out of love. But as Paul says, the law is sometimes a way for us to self-examine, right? Ourselves, say, okay, I acted in this way and it maybe violated the law. Was I acting out of love, right? Was I acting within a concept of grace? And so, in verse 9, chapter 13, it is well for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by regulations about food, which have not benefited those who observed them, right? And so I think the author is still struggling with this concept here, right? And it's a difficult one to deal with because, again, we have to point at something, and the pointing necessarily involves a shadow of the thing.
Ben, I couldn't help but think, I think I've mentioned before how some of our Come Follow Me, Latter-day Peace Studies, Come Follow Me discussions in Come Follow Me study group have ended up with All You Need Is Love, right? And the Beatles song comes up. We've even sung it. And now I can't help but think of Michael Bolton, All for Love. And I think if I'm not misremembering this, that shows up in the movie, the film adaptation of Alexandre Dumas' The Three Musketeers, right? All for Love. And I really love the sentiment too, speaking of love, of bringing in Paul's teaching, right? That it's really all about love, and that since we can't really talk about what that is, what is love, right? Yeah. Not to bring Hathaway into it too. And what's that silly movie? A Night at the Roxbury, right?
Oh.
But yeah.
What is love?
But that's right, yeah. But what is love, right? And so you can see how when we can't really answer that question, all we can do is go to do this, don't do that. And I think, the bottom line has to be intention, right? It's seeking to do what is right. It's seeking to follow Christ, right? It's seeking to follow the example that Jesus set in the stories that come down to us. And what else can we do?
Well, and I think that is the power of the parables, of the stories that Jesus told, right? He's giving examples. I'm thinking of the parable of the Good Samaritan, where, the pre-parable discussion is, the commandments of love God, love your neighbor. And it's not asked in this way, but that's the implication is what is love, right? He doesn't say what is love. He says, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus tells a story, right, about how this person acted. And so he says, go and do likewise, right? Like, what are you doing likewise? You're projecting that love out. And I think that, again, love is something we have to experience in order to know what it is.
The power of love, as you put it. Now I'm thinking of Huey Lewis and the News.
Yeah. So as you mentioned at the beginning, Christopher, there are these verses right at the end of this chapter 13, 22 through 25. They do seem like a little bit of an addition. They could be an interpolation. There wasn't really much in the way of commentary on it, but as I'm reading through it, they feel like an interpolation that someone might have added on to make it appear like Paul wrote this as a letter. Because they mentioned Timothy, right? Who is the perennial like name drop for any pseudo Paul thing. It's just like, well, just drop the name of Timothy, and that's Paul wrote it, right?
I mean, this just doesn't look like a letter at all until we get this, right? It's just not believable. It's a sermon,
and even this part at the end isn't saying that it was Paul, right? Nowhere does this letter claim to be written by Paul, but this does sort of maybe imply that if you take it in the context of the other letters, which I hadn't thought of it until now, might be, if that's what it's doing, it might be some evidence towards saying this must have been written at least after a good number of Paul's letters, and not just after them, but after they had chance to circulate so that people were familiar with Paul's style and so forth. But if this is an addition, then this could have been written at any time, and just at a later time when this letter was curated and added, that this part might have been jotted in at the end.
Who knows? Again, the even the canonicity, yet alone the authorship of this letter has been disputed since early Christianity.
Right, which I don't think we mentioned. That it's why it's placed where it is, right? We talked about how Paul's letters go from longest to shortest, at least the ones attributed to Paul. But then we get Hebrews, which is a lot longer than the others. Well, why is it placed here? Because it was recognized even by those who compiled the order that it's in, that they don't know for sure that this is by Paul. So yeah, it's definitely was never certainly considered by Paul.
Well, that's it for Hebrews.
Yeah. So then we get into these other letters going forward, James, Peter, and John, and we'll save our intro to those till we get to them.
All right. Thank you for listening.
Have a good week, everybody.